Hello and welcome to the C3-1 review video. C3-1 is integration of body systems. Now for this one, if you're in SL only, it is about the brain. And if you're in HL, it's about the brain and plants. So we'll get started. Standard 1. Standard 1. Alright, Standard 1 is kind of like an overview of the whole thing. So it's all about system integration. That's kind of the title of this one. And what we've got going on here is basically saying, how do we function? How are we able to do all of the things that we do? And we're able to do that because there is coordination between the different body systems and cells, etc. Okay? And so they all are working together. So there's coordination between systems, and this allows for an overall function to occur. And I think the next one leads us into here is Standard 2, right? And for Standard 2, once again, we're talking about our emergent properties. Our emergent properties. Our emergent properties is when the sum of the parts, or sum of the whole, is greater than the sum of the parts. So, for example, I have here a pen. If I was to take this pen apart and put all the parts there, it wouldn't work very well because it wouldn't be integrated. And so you need to put it together in just the right way, and then they've got to work together and coordinate together, and then you get a working pen. And so that is the example of like emergent properties. Just because you have all the pieces doesn't mean they'll actually work together. And so this also includes our hierarchy of systems. Oops, spelled hierarchy wrong. Hierarchy of systems that allows these emergent properties to happen. So we start with cells. So you're made up of cells. Those cells group together to form tissues. So tissues are cells that have a similar purpose. There are 4 different kinds of tissue. There's epithelial, which is your lining tissue, muscular tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue. Those 4 tissues make up organs, and depending on the organ, they have multiple types of tissues. And those organs are linked together to make body systems. So you take all of those, and you get body systems, and that leads us to an organism. So we take all of these, they work together, and you get a fully functioning organism. And so for the IB example for this is our cheetah. Yeah, our cheetah, right? It is an effective predator because all of these work together. So it's got the special muscles, it's got really big lungs, it's got like the dislocating shoulders. So all of these work together to allow the cheetah to be the successful predator that it is and chase down those gazelles. Okay. All right, that leads us to Standard 3. Now, Standard 3 is primarily about the different ways we can signal things. And so there's 2 main categories. You have your nervous signaling and you have your hormone signaling. For this one, this is right our endocrine system, and this is the nervous system. And so what you've got going on here is the different ways this can happen. So the nervous signaling, these are all connected by nerves, and it's quick, short signals. So these are being controlled primarily by the brain. These, on the other hand, hormones, they're transported in the blood as hormones, and there's different kinds, right? There's steroids or peptides. That's from previous unit. And so they're long-lasting, and they're also like less targeted, in that it takes them a while to get there. So your nerves are like directly connected to something, whereas these other ones are more free-flowing. Okay. And so this is all about the blood system, and so it's less targeted and it will go wherever it needs to go. But it's longer lasting because they can stay in the blood, whereas signals from the nerves are like that and then they're done. And so between the two of these, you can connect everything together to do whatever it is you need to do. All right, standard 4. The brain is our central processing or our central integration organ. So for humans and most other animals, the brain is the central processing organ. And what we need to know is that it processes information, sends signals, and it's also responsible for learning and memory. So those are the main functions that we need to know about the brain for right now. Oops, sorry, too low. All right, standard 5. Standard 5. Well, okay, we have the brain, but you also have a spinal cord. So the spinal cord is connected to the brain, and it runs down your back. And this is where you have your unconscious processes. So the ones that you're not thinking about. The ones that you're not thinking about. So the spinal cord is all, this is standard 5. And so this is the integration center for these. So you have the brain is the main one, and then you have this one as well too for unconscious processes. Okay. Now, how does your brain receive signals? And your spinal cord, they both receive signals from sensory neurons. So you have sensory neurons that are connected to both the brain and the spinal cord, but really it's like this, right? And it goes like that. And so sensory neurons are taking it in and they're sending it here. Your sensory neurons typically you have some sort of receptor cell, and that receptor cell will trigger a sensory neuron, which will then send the signal. Sometimes the last neuron is the receptor. So for example, your pain neurons, which we'll see in a later unit. Okay, so that's how we get signals. So the receptor cells send signals to the sensory neuron sends it to the brain and the spinal cord, and then your brain takes in that information and decides what to do about it, and we'll learn about what the different parts are when we get to those standards. Now, for standard 7 is all about your cerebral hemispheres. So how do we make movement happen? So this is about movement. So movement is controlled by the cerebral hemispheres. These are like the outer parts of your brain. Cerebral hemispheres, your left and your right side, and they're inversely controlled. And so what happens is your cerebral hemisphere sends a signal through your motor neuron, and then that motor neuron sends a signal to the muscle and tells it to contract. And so this is how movement is initiated. So movement is initiated by this, and it causes it to contract. I'm going to skip down to standard 10. I don't like to go out of order, but I think this one makes more sense right next to it. And we're going to talk about the cerebellum quickly, because the cerebellum is all about balance. And what it does is it coordinates. How does it affect balance? It coordinates muscle contraction. So the cerebral hemispheres send the signal, but this one coordinates it. And so you're like, move your hand, and you move your hand, and the cerebellum's like, okay, now adjust it a little bit, drop it down, and you can write. And so it's all about writing and walking and all of these things that require like extra input. Your cerebellum helps you like not fall over and does all of those things. So that is the purpose of the cerebellum. And it's just a general thing. It's like if you start to fall, your cerebellum will sense that and it'll tell you to adjust, etc. So that's the main thing you need to know, is this an overall control of movements, and it's coordinating it here. So this has that like fine control. Okay, now we can go back to number 7. Or wait, we did 7. Back to number 8, excuse me. So number 8 is the definition of a nerve. So a nerve is a bundle of nerve fibers, and the British spelling is this. Ugh. So confusing. But we typically don't spell it like that, right? And that's fine. We're going to today. Anyway, so we have a bundle of nerve fibers, and when we say a bundle of nerve fibers, it's both sensory and motor neurons. And guess what? They typically run anti-parallel. That's a big word. We've learned that word before, though. Anti-parallel, so the one goes one way and the other goes the other way, right? So if this is like your finger and this is the spinal cord, you'd have your sensory going this way and your motor neuron going back the other way, so it'd send a signal and then it would come back. And so you have a nerve, looks like this, and you have all of these in here, like this. Now, there's also 2 types in here. There's myelinated and unmyelinated. And we'll learn about this in the nerve unit, but basically, if it has like a thick layer around it, those are myelinated, versus the ones without would be like unmyelinated. Okay? So they will look different. They will look different from each other, and you should be able to identify them. So those are the nerve fibers. This whole thing is the nerve, and then this outer coating is called the protective sheath. The outer coating is called the protective sheath. Okay? This diagram here leads us really nicely into standard 9, which is our pain reflex arcs. Pain reflex arcs. So pain reflex arcs are involuntary responses. So you do not think about them. Involuntary means you do not think about them. And you have some sort of signal. So basically, the pain response will start at a free nerve ending of a sensory neuron, and that free nerve ending is going to come back in the neurons unit. Okay, so that's going to be important in the neurons unit when we learn how pain works if you're in HL. But the free nerve ending of a sensory neuron receives a signal, and it's going to send that signal to the spinal cord. And in the spinal cord, what's going to happen is, okay, so the spinal cord, and in the spinal cord, I'm running out of another piece of paper. In the spinal cord, there's what's called an interneuron, And so an interneuron is in between sensory and motor neurons. Like this. This interneuron is in the gray matter. It's in the gray matter. And so this is gray matter. So the gray matter will go vroom, vroom, vroom like this. There is white matter, and the white matter sends signals to the brain. Okay, so gray matter, part of the loop. So the gray matter is part of the loop. The white matter sends signals to the brain. And so what you've got going on here is sensory sends a signal to the interneuron, the gray matter sends it to the motor neuron, reflex loop, done. And it's going to make the thing happen. And so it's going to be like pull away, run, whatever it is. And so it's boom, done. And so that is our pain reflex arc. And so it's fast. It's way quicker than you feeling something, going, something bad is happening. I've got to do something about it. And so instead it's like boom, boom, done. So that is our pain reflex arcs. Now, 11, because we already did 10. 11, how do we maintain circadian rhythms? Circadian rhythms are, in this case, primarily we're talking about our sleep-wake cycle. So when are we awake and when are we asleep? And so melatonin is our hormone. Is a hormone from the pineal gland that affects whether we fall asleep or not. It is primarily secreted at night. And so during the day, so it's low during the day, peaks at night, and then drops back off again, like this. And so that helps keep you asleep. So this is high concentration, low, and so this goes, it goes up and down and up and down. And it would continue to do the same pattern. And you can see how that would create a circadian rhythm and keep you sleeping when you're supposed to and awake when you're not supposed to. Light obviously can stimulate it. So this is why when they talk about blue light being bad for you, that's one of the main things they're talking about, is it messes with your secretion of melatonin. All right, standard 12 is all about epinephrine or adrenaline. They're the same thing, right? So we learned that in a previous unit. Epinephrine and adrenaline are the same thing. They're one of the rare things that there's not like a correct name for. They are both accepted names. So epinephrine and adrenaline are part of the fight or flight response. They're all about activating your body for vigorous activity. And so when you activate this one, you're preparing yourself to either run or fight, whatever it might be. And so there's a variety of different things that are going to happen here in this one. And so it's going to increase heart rate and blood pressure. It's going to increase air passage size to let in more air. It's going to dilate your pupils, make big eyes. It's going to increase blood sugar levels. So you should know how that happens, right? It's a good review. It increases blood supply to muscles. So this is a good example of a hormone not being super targeted. It acts on a lot of different things to trigger all of these different things so that you're ready to fight or flight. It comes from the adrenal gland. Adrenal gland, right? It comes from the adrenal gland. And so Yeah. And so this is all about intense muscle contraction. Right? So you want to have the maximum power to your muscles. This is, whenever you hear the story of the people oh, they lifted that car, well, adrenaline is a big part in how that can happen because it pumps your body up for it. Yeah, so that would be that one. All right, now let's see. Let's flip it over. Okay, now, how does the endocrine system get controlled? So at the beginning we said there was the two different systems that are being controlled. Now here's where it gets silly, right? Well, the endocrine system is controlled by the nervous system. Mind blown. Or not, right? Because it's all about your mind. It's primarily controlled by two things, two parts of your brain: the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. These are both part of the brain. These are both in the brain. There are two types. There's two different pituitary glands, but you don't need to know that right now. There's an anterior and a posterior, but that is beyond the scope of our class. And so basically what happens is the hypothalamus here will receive signals. Okay, so the hypothalamus receives sensory input. Okay, and then it sends signals to the pituitary gland, nerve signaling, and then the pituitary gland will release hormones. And then those hormones will go act on other glands to make them release hormones. And so you get this cycle of hormone release all being controlled by the hypothalamus. This is the generic overview. For some of them, you need to know a little more specific. So for example, for temperature, right? So for temperature, you receive a signal, temp, you're cold. Oh no, I'm cold. And then the hypothalamus, that goes to the hypothalamus. And then that sends a signal to the pituitary gland, and then that releases TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, which acts on the thyroid, which causes it to secrete thyroxine, which then goes and increases metabolism, or heat production, right? Because increasing metabolism increases heat production, so it really should be low temperature. Increased metabolism, which increases body heat. Boom, and done. That's a good example. That's a refresher from one of our previous units. Okay, that is standard 13. Nice. Standard 14. Heart rate control. So heart rate is controlled primarily by two things: baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. So baroreceptors sense pressure changes. Chemoreceptors sense pH changes. Alright, so baroreceptors are regulating pressure, and chemoreceptors are regulating blood pH, Well, these are both blood. And so what they do is they sense changes in these, and they send these signals to the medulla. The medulla is another part of the brain. And then the medulla will then send a signal to the SA node, or the sinoatrial node, to control the heartbeat. And so what it'll do is, depending on what's happening, it can affect both the heart rate and the stroke volume. Stroke volume is amount of blood per pump. So if you're trying to change the blood pressure, you'd really be adjusting this one, as well as the heart rate, but primarily this one. And if you're trying to adjust this one, it's primarily going to be this one with a little bit of that one. Okay, so they are slightly different. And so when we talk about blood pH, really what it's doing is it's measuring the amount of CO2. So if you increase the CO2, you decrease the pH because it forms carbonic acid, and that low pH is bad. It's like, help. We have too much CO2 in the blood. We need more oxygen. So if there's ever higher CO2, that means there's less oxygen due to cell respiration. Baroreceptors, I almost forgot to tell you where they are. right? Baroreceptors, they're in the aortic arch, the carotid artery, and there's one more, aortic arch, carotid artery, and the atria. They're found in both atria, as well as pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins. Those are the main spots where you find them. So aortic arch, right out of the aorta, carotid goes up in your brain, the atria are receiving blood from the body, and then the pulmonary veins are bringing it back to the heart. And then chemoreceptors are basically found brain, heart, blood vessels. They're found all throughout. Then they help tell you like where you need more. Okay. 15. 15 is feedback control of ventilation rate. So for this one, it's primarily just chemoreceptors. And those chemoreceptors act on the brain stem now. They send signals to the brain stem. And the brain stem will send signals to the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. And so if you have high CO2, you'll have low pH, which means you need to increase ventilation rate. So these are the two muscle sets, right, that control ventilation rate. And so by sending the signal to the brainstem, you say, oh, contract more, please. We need to breathe faster to try and get rid of that CO2 and take in more oxygen. Okay, now you have this thing called the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is things that are controlled without the central nervous system. So no central nervous system. And that is the process of digestion. Digestion. So there's parts at the beginning and end are controlled. So swallowing food, and then egestion of feces is under voluntary control. So this is voluntary control, this is voluntary control. But then the part in the middle is not under, it's involuntary control. Okay? And so this part here is all done by the enteric nervous system with no signaling from the central nervous system. And what it's doing is, it's basically just using sensory neurons and motor neurons to push food forward. And so basically the sensory neurons, they sense food, and then the motor neurons push it. And what they do is they push behind and relax in front of it. And so what you get is you have this thing that looks like this. Here's your intestine. Here's your food. And so here you can see it's relaxing, and here it's gonna like pinch inward and contract. This part is called the bolus of food. And so it's contracting and relaxing to push it in this direction like that. And so that is how food is moved. It's just like senses the food there with the sensory neurons, and then the motor neurons tell it to contract and move it forward. If you are in SL, you're done. Yay, you don't need to know anything about plants. SL is done. Now we move on to the HL only. If you're in HL, it's time to talk about the plants. So the first one is our tropic responses in seedlings. And so basically, you have your little seedling, and it's going to start to sprout. And what we noticed when we did it is you had something going this way and something going this way. And so we could see that it'll go towards the light. One part goes towards the light, and one part goes down. So this would be like the root, and this would be the stem. And so they respond to these different things, and these are called tropic responses. So there's gravitropism as well as phototropism, and you can take a guess which one's which. And so they're going to respond differently depending on the part of the plants. Okay. that's standard 17. Standard 18. The main thing we need to know is that in plant shoots, the parts that are going up, they will grow towards the light. So if the light is primarily like over here, they will bend towards it. And so this is going to be called positive phototropism, because they're growing towards the light. Positive phototropism. And so this is one of the main growth responses in plants. Positive phototropism is when they grow towards the light. This is specifically lateral light, right? So it's to the side, lateral light. So they're always going to try and grow towards the light so they can maximize photosynthesis. How is that controlled? Well, it's controlled, like everything in plants, by what we call phytohormones or plant hormones. So there's a variety of them. There's a lot of different ones, and so we're going to learn about a lot of them in the next couple standards. But phytohormones are plant hormones, and they signal for growth, development, and respond to stimuli like light and herbivory and all kinds of other things, right? So we learned about allelopathy, we learned about antibiotic secretion, and defense against herbivory. All of those are also going to be signaled by phytohormones. Okay. There's a wide variety. You don't need to know most of them, but you will need to know some of them. So 20, let's talk about our first one we do need to know. So 20 and 21 are all about auxin. And so 22 is a little bit about auxin. So auxin. Auxin is a phytohormone that is created. It's primarily created where there is light. So it's created where there is in light. So it's created and those cells are activated, and it's created when pigments receive it, sends a signal to make auxin. Now, it can go into cells freely, but cannot leave them. Well, so then if you need to move it, you have to move it using what are called auxin efflux carriers. And so these are proteins that you put on one side of the cell membrane only to move it in a specific direction. And so what we learned about in phototropism is you want to move it this way to the shady side. And so you'll notice that the carriers are only on this side of the membrane. And so auxin will be out, and then we'll go in, and then out, and in, and then out, to where you want it to be. And so it'll keep going until you get to the last cell. And then I'll enter here. All right, so now that's how you move the auxin. And these are called auxin efflux carriers, and they allow you to figure out where it is. And so you concentrate the carriers on one side of each cell to cause it to move. And so it's actively transported, right? It's ported, and if they're all coordinated correctly, it will accumulate on one side of the plant. Now, what does this do? Well, it's going to actually cause cell growth. It's going to cause the cells to get bigger, particularly on one side. And so what it does is it causes auxin causes an increase in proton pump creation. So it's a transcription factor that's going to upregulate proton pumps. That upregulation of proton pumps is going to move hydrogen ions into the cell wall area, or also known as the apoplast. So this is the gap between the cell membrane and the cell wall. From there, what it does is the H+ ions activate elastin. And elastin loosens crosslinks with cellulose. What this does is it causes cell elongation. So basically, you have the one side of the cell, this side here, will elongate. And that elongation causes cell growth. And so this is primarily used in phototropism. All right, 22. You have your tree, right? Auxin is made often near the top because that's where the most light is. And then cytokinin is made at the bottom. And they move like this. And the ratio of them affects growth. And what this allows you to do is make sure the tree doesn't get too large, etc. And so what you have going on, you change the different ratios, and you can affect cell division and cell growth. So auxin is for cell growth, and then cytokinin is for cell division. You compare them together, and you end up with integrated growth. Integrated root and shoot growth. Because you don't want one to grow more than the other. That will lead to problems. The last standard is my favorite. It's fruit ripening. This one has the most useful, directly useful knowledge. So fruits produce ethylene. And ethylene tells you to ripen. Well, it also tells nearby fruits to ripen. And then they're going to create more ethylene, which is going to cause them to ripen, which then creates more ethylene, also creating a positive feedback loop. And so this ethylene will stimulate in other ones, which will stimulate in other ones. This makes it rapid and synchronized. So that way your fruits are all ripe at the same time, increases the likelihood that they will be eaten, and it causes them to be better for herbivores. And that is C31.